People think Henry VIII's wives were buried and left alone, but they weren't. 6 women, 6 endings, and a burial record that, for centuries, nobody seriously questioned. That last part matters. When I started going through the primary sources, I expected the usual. I found vague records, incomplete documentation, and the kind of gaps you expect from the 16th century. What I didn't expect was how much of the mess came after the burials. Not neglect, but intervention, reopening, rearrangement. In some cases, there were repeated visits where pieces were physically removed and taken home. None of it was hidden or secret. It's in the renovation logs, the antiquarian accounts, and the letters of the people who were there. The clean version of this story: 6 wives, 6 sealed coffins, 6 final resting places, survived not because it's accurate, but because it's easier. Start with Jane Seymour because she's supposed to be the easy one. Henry chose to be buried beside her. That single fact tells you how deliberately her burial was arranged. This wasn't rushed, and it wasn't political pressure. It was a plan Henry held for a decade after her death in 1537. It was St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. There was a specific vault beneath the choir. There was a specific position within it, designed to place them side by side. For generations, that precision was treated as permanence. Then, in 1813, the vault was opened, and this is what they found. Charles I's coffin, a lead-lined box nearly 6 feet long, had been placed directly between Henry and Jane. It was squeezed into a gap that wasn't designed for it during a rushed burial in 1649. Parliamentary forces were in control, and nobody was particularly concerned with the existing arrangement. The Stuart king had been placed wherever he fit. This happened to be between the Tudor king and the wife he'd spent a decade planning to lie beside. Jane's coffin was still sealed, and nothing was taken. In the most technical sense, she hadn't been disturbed. She just wasn't where she was supposed to be anymore. What's revealing isn't what happened, it's how little it changed anything. The vault was re-examined, noted, documented, and then the narrative moved on. The standard account of Jane Seymour's burial still describes it as stable, permanent, undisturbed. Tudor ideas about a final resting place were a lot more fluid than we like to admit. The arrangement Henry spent years designing lasted less than a century before someone needed the space. If that's the fate of the most carefully planned burial in this story, the question that follows is obvious. What happened to the ones that weren't planned at all? Anne Boleyn's burial was, by design, not dignified. She was executed on the 19th of May, 1536, her head removed by a French swordsman. Henry arranged this specifically because a French swordsman was considered more skilled than an English axeman. That detail is revealing. Even in the manner of her death, there was a performance of consideration, a kind of courtesy that sat alongside the execution order he'd signed, and she was buried quickly in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, within the Tower of London. The container used for her body was an arrow chest, a wooden box used to transport arrows. There was no coffin prepared in advance, no marked grave, no stone. The chapel floor already held multiple burials from previous executions, most of them undocumented in any precise way. She was placed, the floor was sealed, and within a generation, exactly where she lay had become genuinely uncertain. That uncertainty lasted more than 300 years. Then, in 1876, during renovation works ordered by Queen Victoria, remains were found beneath the chapel floor. A skeleton. The proportions were consistent with contemporary descriptions of Anne. Slight build, notably long neck. Evidence pointed toward death by sword rather than axe. Consistent with her method of execution, a set of remains that, in the words of the official report, presented every appearance of the skeleton. of a female of between 25 and 35 years of age. The identification was announced. The remains were reinterred beneath a new ledger stone, the black marble slab you can visit today, with Anne's name carved into it. Here's what stands out when you go back through the 1876 documentation. The team conducting the excavation found remains from multiple individuals in that chapel. Multiple executions. Multiple women placed in the same ground, without markers, precise enough to distinguish one burial from another. The process of identifying Anne involved a process of elimination, ruling out what the remains couldn't be, rather than any positive confirmation of what they were. The skeleton was compatible with being Anne's. That's the honest version of what the evidence shows. The ledger stone presents it as settled, and most accounts since 1876 have treated it that way. That stone does a lot of work, not as a grave marker, but as a full stop. A declaration that the question is closed, because closed questions don't generate doubt, and doubt is messy. And the Tower of London is a heritage site that receives millions of visitors a year. The uncertainty didn't go away in 1876. It was just given somewhere to stand. And then there's the case that actually keeps me up at night, because it doesn't even have the comfort of a wrong answer. Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, probably 16 or 17 when they married, almost certainly younger than 20 when she was executed in February 1542, buried, according to every historical record that mentions her burial, in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, same floor as Anne, same ground. The 1876 renovation team searched for her, but they found nothing they could attribute to her with any confidence. She's listed. The accounts say she's there, but there's just no physical evidence. There was no coffin. There were no identifiable remains. No confirmed location that places her in that chapel beyond the written assertion that someone put her there in 1542. This is genuinely haunting. The silence around Catherine Howard doesn't feel accidental. When I've gone looking through what survives from the Tower administration in the 1540s, there's documentation for all kinds of things. The absence of any precise record of her burial location feels less like negligence and more like indifference, like nobody in authority thought it worth noting exactly where a teenage girl who had embarrassed the king was placed. That's a different kind of erasure than Anne's. Anne's grave was unmarked. Catherine's location was apparently not considered worth marking in anyone's records at all. And that detail, that small, almost bureaucratic cruelty, rewrites the whole story. Because if the historical record can be that careless about a queen's burial, even one executed publicly, even one whose death was a significant political event, then the question isn't just where Catherine Howard is. The question is, how many of the others are only accounted for because nobody looked hard enough to find the problem? The standard account gets a lot right. She was Henry's first wife, married in 1509 when he was 17, and she was 23. Discarded, effectively, from around 1527 onward, as Henry pursued both Anne Boleyn and the annulment he needed to marry her. Catherine refused, consistently, stubbornly, at enormous personal cost, to accept that the marriage had ever been invalid. That refusal helped produce the English Reformation as a kind of administrative consequence. She died in January 1536 at Kimbleton Castle. The official cause was cancer of the heart, which is what 16th century physicians call the tumor of the pericardium. There were rumors at the time about other possibilities. I'm not going to tell you those rumors are confirmed, because they're not. What I will say is that her embalmer reported finding an anomaly in the condition of her heart during the preparation of her body, and that report has generated speculation for nearly 5 centuries without ever being resolved. She was buried at Peterborough Cathedral, not London, not Windsor. Peterborough, roughly 80 miles from the capital, in a city that had no particular political significance. The distance was intentional. Even dead, Catherine's proximity to the center of power was something the new order preferred to minimize. People visit, leave pomegranates, her personal symbol, in a tradition that has developed organically over the decades. By the standard account, her burial is the stable one, the intact one, a lead coffin, identifiable, apparently undisturbed. But here's what stands out. In the 1640s, during the English Civil War, Peterborough was occupied by parliamentary forces. Cathedrals across England were treated as targets. These symbols of royalist loyalty and Catholic tradition made them appropriate places to make a point at Peterborough specifically. Documented accounts show damage to monuments and stained glass, and the medieval fabric of the building was altered in ways that took generations to repair. Catherine of Aragon's grave. No detailed account exists of what happened to it during those years, not that it was protected or damaged, but restored. A gap in the record at exactly the moment when disturbance was most plausible. What survives is the account from after the restoration, a lead coffin, apparently intact, and that post-war account has been backfilled onto the entire period. It is treated as though the coffin's condition in 1660 or 1680 tells us something definitive about what it went through in 1643. It doesn't. It tells us what someone found when they looked, but it doesn't tell us what happened in between. If you think about it, suppose you sealed a room in 1536 and abandoned it during a war in the 1640s. You came back in the 1660s to find the furniture rearranged, but the door locked. You wouldn't conclude that nobody had been inside. You'd conclude that whoever went in had the sense to lock the door when they left, and a resealed lead coffin is not evidence of an undisturbed lead coffin. It is evidence that the coffin was sealed when someone last looked at it. Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth wife, is the one where the pattern stops being subtle. She survived him, which shouldn't be understated, because by 1547, surviving Henry required a specific combination of political skill, personal restraint, and luck. She died in September 1548 from complications following childbirth, about a year after Henry's death. She was buried at the Chapel of St. Mary's at Sudley Castle in Gloucestershire. The chapel fell into ruin over the following 2 centuries. The grave was lost, not destroyed, just lost. Nobody knew exactly where she was. When her coffin was rediscovered in 1782, the people who opened it were not professionals. They were a group of local men, drawn by curiosity about the ruined chapel. What they found stopped them. The body inside appeared remarkably well preserved. 234 years in a sealed lead coffin in relatively stable conditions had produced something that, to 18th century eyes, looked almost recent. Hair, still present. Facial features, still partially recognizable. But the preservation wasn't total. This wasn't a mummy in the classical sense, but it was far beyond what anyone expected to find. That discovery should have been the end of the story. The coffin was resealed, and then reopened the following year, when word had spread, and then reopened again and again. Looking through the accounts, and there are several written by different people at different times, what struck me wasn't the descriptions of what they found. It was the tone. These were educated men, many of them clergy or local gentry, describing their visits with what I can only call enthusiasm. They were proud to have been there. Proud to have seen her. Several of them took pieces, locks of hair, fragments of fabric from. Doing anything wrong in the 18th century, a certain kind of antiquarian curiosity was considered a mark of refinement. To visit a significant historical site, to observe and document what you found, to bring back a physical memento. These were things that educated people did. They would have found it bizarre to be told that observation was a form of destruction. The whole framework through which they understood what they were doing told them they were preserving something, recording it, honoring it even. What that framework didn't account for was the physics of what happens when you repeatedly open a sealed environment to air. Every time the coffin was opened, decomposition that had been suspended for decades was restarted. Every fragment of fabric removed was gone permanently. Every visit that produced a slightly different description of what remained was producing that different description because the previous visit had changed what was there to be seen. The accounts from the 1780s describe preservation that still appeared remarkable. The accounts from the early 1800s describe something already beginning to deteriorate. By the time the grave was finally restored and properly resealed in the 1860s, what remained of Catherine Parr bore almost no resemblance to what had been found in 1782. 234 years of sealed preservation, undone in roughly 80 years of enthusiastic documentation, and not one of the people who visited believed they were part of the problem. Each of them thought the problem was everyone who had come before. I've spent a lot of time sitting with these cases, trying to figure out what connects them, because on the surface, they look completely different. Jane Seymour's vault was rearranged for political convenience. Anne Boleyn was identified through a process that proved compatibility rather than identity. Catherine Howard is physically missing. Catherine of Aragon passed through a war with no surviving record of what that passage meant. Catherine Parr was taken apart, piece by piece, by people who were certain they were doing something honorable. Different fates, different types of failure in the record. But here's what I keep coming back to. In every single case, the burial was treated as a resource, something to be used to solve a space problem, to resolve a historical question, to satisfy curiosity, to generate social status for the person who got to say they'd been there. The women were dead, but their remains were still being recruited to serve purposes that had nothing to do with them. That didn't end in the 16th century. It's still happening. Every time a documentary presents the ledger stone at the tower as definitive proof of Anne Boleyn's burial location, it's recruiting those remains to produce a sense of resolved history that the physical evidence doesn't actually support. The purposes have changed. The pattern is the same, something rarely said about royal burial in Tudor England. It was never primarily for the dead. It was a statement, a carefully managed one, about what version of a person would be carried forward and who would control that version. Where a queen was buried communicated something. What condition the grave was kept in communicated something. Whether the location was marked with a monument or allowed to become vague, that was a choice. Every single one of those choices was made by people who outlived the woman in question, for reasons that had nothing to do with her preferences, and everything to do with what was useful. Jane Seymour got Windsor because a vault at Windsor, beside a king, said something about the legitimacy of her son Edward's claim to the throne. Anne Boleyn got an arrow chest and an unmarked chapel floor because, at the moment of her death, the court needed her to vanish. Not dramatically, not in a way that made her a martyr, but practically, administratively. Catherine of Aragon was sent to Peterborough because, even dead, her presence near London felt like a problem. These were not sentimental decisions. They were political ones, and the politics didn't stop when the burial was sealed. What's interesting is how that pattern continued through every subsequent generation that inherited these graves. The Victorians who excavated the Tower Chapel in the 1870s were not grave robbers. They were responding to a genuine historical question about Anne Boleyn's location, using the best methods available to them under a commission from the Crown. But they also produced a conclusion, and then a monument, that translated a careful assessment into a public certainty. The ledger stone doesn't say remains consistent with Anne Boleyn. It says Anne Boleyn, full stop. That translation from probably to definitely served a purpose. The Tower of London needed a definitive grave. The narrative of Anne Boleyn needed a physical location you could point to. The monument solved both problems at once, and once the stone was laid, it became almost impossible to publicly reopen the question without seeming like you were attacking a beloved historical site. The memory of each of these women has been shaped, reshaped, and in some cases completely rebuilt, in ways that say far more about the era doing the reshaping than about the woman herself. Catherine of Aragon has been a Catholic martyr, a stubborn obstacle to progress, a romantic, tragic figure, a proto-feminist who refused to be discarded. Jane Seymour has been Henry's great love, Henry's most convenient wife, a woman whose primary historical function was to produce a male heir and die before the marriage could deteriorate, depending on which century is telling the story. Anne Boleyn has accumulated more versions of herself than almost any other figure in English history. Witch, schemer, victim, visionary. Depending on what the moment needed her to be, Catherine Parr is usually remembered as the one who survived, which I think is the saddest reduction of the lot. She was a scholar. She published books. She managed the kingdom as regent while Henry was at war in France. She was, by most measures, one of the most intellectually formidable people in Henry's court, regardless of gender, and she is remembered, primarily, for having outlived a man who had executed two of her predecessors. The memory is always a negotiation between what actually happened and what the present moment finds useful, flattering, dramatic, or commercially viable. Heritage sites need visitors. Publishers need hooks. Documentaries need narratives that can sustain 90 minutes without losing an audience. None of those things are served by, we don't actually know. So, we don't actually know gets quietly managed into something more navigable. There's a version of this story that feels complete. Jane Seymour at Windsor, Anne Boleyn beneath the ledger stone at the Tower, Catherine Howard nearby in the same chapel, Catherine of Aragon at Peterborough, Catherine Parr at Soudley. Her grave finally properly maintained. 5 locations, 5 names, a map you can follow. That version exists. It's in the guidebooks. It's what you'll be told if you visit any of these sites and ask a guide. It is also, if you look closely at the actual evidence, a collection of best guesses, contested identifications, and strategic silences, presented with enough confidence that the guesswork has become invisible. The locations may be correct, but the certainty is performed rather than earned. And there's a difference between those two things that matters. Especially when the people inside the coffins were real women whose fates were already distorted enough in life. They deserved accurate accounting. What they got, in most cases, was convenient accounting. After all of this, one thing becomes clear. What happened to Henry VIII's wives after their deaths? What happened to Henry VIII's wives after their deaths is a version of what happened to them during their lives. Their stories were managed, their locations were assigned, their identities were defined by people with agendas, and the account that survives, tidy, resolved, marked by ledger stones and maintained tombs, reflects the needs of whoever was last in a position to shape it. Catherine Howard is the crack in the wall that doesn't fill. If she isn't in the Tower, and I want to be clear, there's no physical evidence that she is, then where is she? Some historians have suggested the Howard family may have retrieved her remains privately. There are accounts of the family having significant influence at court even after Catherine's execution. And retrieving a family member's body from a disgraced burial was not unheard of in the period. But the trail goes cold in 1542. There's no record of a retrieval, no alternative burial site, no document that resolves it. So, I'll put it to you directly. Do you think Catherine Howard is still beneath the floorboards of that chapel? Or was she moved, privately, quietly, in a way nobody thought to write down? And her presence there has been asserted by history, simply because the alternative is too messy to accommodate. I genuinely don't know. And I've looked. That's the thing about these burials that I keep coming back to. The certainty was always the goal. The evidence was gathered to support it, and the gaps, the rearranged vault, the identification that proved consistency rather than identity, the queen who cannot be physically located, the body that changed each time someone looked at it, was smoothed over one by one until the story felt finished. It isn't finished. It's just been told with enough confidence for long enough that the difference stopped being visible. Catherine Howard is the one that doesn't resolve.